Hi everyone, welcome to week 6. For this week, we're going to be talking about Leibniz's discourse on metaphysics, which is a very difficult text. Before we get into it, I would really like to sort of give a short overview of Leibniz and his life and sort of like why we would think of him as being important. If you look at like Leibniz's Wikipedia page, it's pretty startling. Like it's very intimidating basically just how much Leibniz was able to accomplish in his own lifetime. He's probably most well known for discovering calculus. Most contemporary mathematicians find that Leibniz's discovery of the calculus has better notation than Newton's discovery of the calculus. And not only that, he was an inventor, he was an ambassador, he was a historian. The extent of sort of Leibniz's accomplishments in the 17th century are really, really astounding. Diderot, he was another sort of like philosopher or humanities type person. He once said that, whenever you compare your own accomplishments to that of a Leibniz, that you like want to go off into some dark corner to die alone. And I think that even, other like very accomplished philosophers really have this feeling whenever they approach the work of Leibniz. And this is really important in some ways because I think that Leibniz's reception is pretty spotty in the sense that Leibniz went through several periods where he and his work were very deeply unpopular. Um, so part of the story for this is that Leibniz was accused by Newton of plagiarizing the calculus, and this ended up getting Leibniz expelled from a number of honorary societies that he was a part of. It made it such that people didn't really respect his accomplishments because he was seen as just sort of like a plagiarist of Newton and other figures. And he was sort of a representative of a kind of German backwardsness in comparison with other countries, So, like, Newton's accomplishments are celebrated and recognized and, esteemed in various ways, whereas Leibniz is seen as sort of just piggybacking off of his accomplishments and even plagiarizing them. However, contemporary scholars who have gone back and sort of looked at Leibniz's text and Newton's text can say with a lot of confidence that Leibniz did not, in fact, plagiarize Newton. And that even though, just to give a sense of this, like Leibniz's funeral, basically no one attended because he was seen as deeply unpopular and unimportant. And this is sort of reflected in the way that we most often think about Leibniz now and the ideas of Leibniz that we've sort of retained in sort of like the popular consciousness of people that will take these sort of philosophy classes. And probably the most notable of Leibniz's belief, which is regularly sort of singled out as an example of his ridiculousness, is his optimism. And so what people refer to whenever they talk about Leibniz's optimism is his belief that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and that God, as the creator of the world, would not ever, create a world that would be anything less than perfect. That just does not really cohere with Leibniz's understanding of God. And, just living in the world, it can be at times difficult to take this idea very seriously because we so often are subject to aspects of the world that are not perfect, or at least do not seem at all perfect to us. It seems like in a lot of situations that we are subject to needless suffering, and that this very much counts against Leibniz's apparently absurd belief that God would create the best of all possible worlds. And one, sort of historical event that really brought this into popular consciousness is the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, which happened in Portugal. And the reason why this event was so significant for the reception of Leibniz and the importance of his philosophy is that this event, I believe it was like hundreds or thousands of people ended up dying in a completely needless way. And people would point to events like this, as a natural disaster to try to say, well, how is it possible that we live in the best of all possible worlds if there is naturally produced and completely needless suffering that is produced within the world? And so Leibniz is sort of routinely mocked for his belief that we live in the best of all possible worlds. And typically, whenever you introduce Leibniz, you'll do it also by sort of introducing Voltaire, who is another philosopher of roughly the same time period, who basically has a character in one of his works, Candide, that is based on mocking Leibniz and his parochial, myopic understanding of the world. And so I say all of this just to say that the typical way that people learn about Leibniz is they're introduced to Leibniz as a figure who is already outdated. He's already at the very moment of his writing seen by a lot of people to be essentially outmoded, conservative, and representative of a sort of German backwardness. Germany at this time does not have like a unified country. Basically there are all these sort of little principalities sort of loosely connected through the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire. And part of Leibniz's philosophy is trying to go back to the Greeks and to scholastic philosophy to try to see, okay, what about these old, ancient Greek and medieval traditions is really worth retaining for the modern era. And so this sort of also contributes to the vision of Leibniz as a sort of backwards Germanic figure. He's sort of like considered anachronistic in the sense that he doesn't really belong to the time period that he is involved in. And so part of the way that I want to cover Leibniz in this class is to deliberately oppose this conception of Leibniz as someone who is essentially outmoded, unimportant, sort of a dogmatic religious figure, in contrast to the sort of great strides that are made in secular philosophy by Descartes and Spinoza, as well as all of the empiricist philosophers that we're going to be discussing after Leibniz. So Leibniz is the last figure, along with Marquise du Châtelet, that we're going to be discussing that is really part of the rationalist tradition. So the belief that you arrive at the most fundamental truths about reality through the use of pure reason alone. And so that's sort of like why we would be inclined to put Leibniz in conversation with Descartes and Spinoza. But he was also in healthy conversation with a number of the empiricist philosophers who we're going to be spending most of the second half of the semester discussing. And so he was very widely read and very, sort of interested in the contemporary problems of modern times. And essentially the little experiment that I would like for us to conduct in this class is to try as much as possible to take Leibniz seriously and to really try to understand him as a philosopher, not just someone who says sort of kooky things every now and again, but there has to be, something to Leibniz's philosophy. If he can be the kind of person to, like, invent a calculator that can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, if he's the kind of person that can discover differential calculus, if he can discover the foundations, basically, of linguistics and computer science, then he probably has something to say to us today that is of contemporary relevance beyond just sort of like theological disputes or understandings. So our goal is, let's find what's in Leibniz. Let's find what's in Leibniz that's worth keeping, even if we want to try to abandon some of the theological tenets that Leibniz is going to talk about. Let's figure out together how to make them interesting and relevant for us in the 21st century. Maybe we have more of a secular approach than Leibniz does. And that's okay, but we need to try to figure out what it is in Leibniz's philosophy that continues to be relevant today. It's really hard to it's really hard to overstate the significance of Leibniz for the development of the history of philosophy, because Leibniz is sort of the bedrock foundation of what is called the analytic tradition in philosophy. And basically, the analytic tradition in philosophy is defined, at least in part, by some formal logic, some new features in formal logic that emerged in the 20th century, and part of the way that they discover those is by going back and reading Leibniz and taking him very seriously. So Leibniz is sort of like at the foundation of the most popular way of engaging with philosophy in the Western world. And increasingly, analytic philosophy, even though it begins primarily in the UK and the United States, so it's sort of like an Anglo-American sort of phenomena, it's now sort of extended its reach such that it's widely popular almost everywhere in the world. It's seen as the default paradigm by which people engage with philosophy. So with all that being said, Leibniz is a really incredible and essential philosopher, even though, we might be poised to disagree with a lot of the conclusions that Leibniz draws. And so the challenge that this presents to us is to try to examine the exact place in which we differ from Leibniz. Where, what is it about Leibniz's philosophy that we can retain, and which elements of it do we have to abandon? Which elements of it are essentially outdated, and which ones are not? And so to understand the discourse on metaphysics and Leibniz's metaphysics more generally, I think that it's important to contrast Leibniz's conception of God with Descartes and Spinoza. So here we have three different pictures of God. We have Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. And essentially, the distinction between these three figures is how they conceive of the activity of God. So, as you might recall from the Meditations, Descartes holds that God doesn't act for any reason outside of himself. So God acts in a way that we can not really ask for reasons for God's behavior. So God simply decides on the laws of like geometry and arithmetic and all of the sort of a priori disciplines that we think of, and he could have decided to make them entirely differently if that was his will. And this is part of how Descartes understands the infinity of God. If God were constrained by reasons, then he would not truly be infinite on Descartes' conception of God. And then similarly for Spinoza, God never acts in the sense that we act, right? When we think of our actions, they occur in time, they happen for reasons that are contingent, that can change, right? But for Spinoza, all of the features of God stem directly from his essence. And God's essence is outside of time, and hence it never changes, right? And so this is Spinoza's anthropomorphic conception of God, is that God isn't really like us where we're finite contingent beings, we have to make certain decisions that occur in time. God isn't like that, right? God never changes. The essence, everything about God proceeds strictly from his essence, and all of that remains the same all throughout time. And hence, this is why, Spinoza can say Dies sive natura, which means basically God is nature. There is no distinction between God and the ultimate nature of reality. Those just simply amount to being the same thing. And this is why Spinoza was such an unorthodox religious figure. Now, what we have introduced in Leibniz is an alternative perspective from both Descartes and Spinoza. Leibniz is concerned that both Descartes and Spinoza, their conceptions of God, lead us to ultimately doubt the veracity of scripture, so the Christian religious tradition, but more fundamentally, it leads us to doubt whether or not God is truly, contains every perfection, whether he's omniscient, he knows everything, omnipotent, if he can do everything, or omnibenevolent, or if he always, acts in such a way as to produce the greatest good. So according to Leibniz's conception of God, God acts for the best possible reason in every circumstance. Unlike Descartes, God does not act arbitrarily, right? For Leibniz, this would be to ascribe an imperfection to God. The reason why it would be to ascribe an imperfection to God is because when we act arbitrarily or for no reason, that we see this as an imperfection, right? It would be better not only if we acted for a reason, but if we acted for good reasons. And so insofar as we think of this as a perfection in human beings, if God contains every perfection, then we should think about God not as following no reasons, or God as never acting in Spinoza, but we should think of God as acting for the best reason that we could ever possibly conceive of. And so on this picture, God creates, he produces creation and so on, but he does so for reasons and principles that we can potentially understand, right? So like maybe we don't know like why God, created all of the properties of some particular object, say our textbook, right? We might not be able to understand all of the dimensions of how God created this object. However, what we can understand are the general principles underlying God's reasons. So, like, for example, we can know that nothing happens without a reason. That for any of the qualities or features of this textbook, we can ask the question, why is it like that? And in asking that question, we can at least, conceivably, potentially discover a reason for why the textbook is the way it is. And so this is fundamentally different from Descartes, who, has always the possibility of saying that God's decisions are completely arbitrary and that we have no rational insight into them, or Spinoza, where God doesn't act at all. For Leibniz, it's important that God does act and that God acts from the best possible reasons. And this is ultimately the source of Leibniz's claim that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Because Leibniz ultimately says, why would God, who has all of these omni features, is all intelligent, all good, and all powerful, why would he ever create a world that is anything less than the best possible world? And Leibniz says that is, strictly speaking, just incompatible with traditional orthodox monotheistic conceptions of God. If God really does have all of these properties, then we must think of God as creating the best of all possible worlds. So this conception of God and the difference between Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz's conception of God is absolutely essential for understanding some of the trickier elements or dimensions of Leibniz's philosophy. Because when Leibniz is trying to describe sort of like a God's eye perspective or point of view, he's trying to describe the way that things actually are, like abstracting from the way that we have to think about them as finite embodied creatures that have all of these limitations and so on and so forth. Leibniz, in describing a God's eye point of view, wants to describe not just the way that we as human beings must conceive of things, but the way that they are essentially, the way that they are if you could know everything about the object, and all of its features and all of the reasons for why it is the way that it is. And so you can see then why Leibniz's talk about God really closely coheres with a scientific, experimental perspective. Because in scientific terms, we are often trying to discover the way that things are outside of the particular perspective that's offered by a singular experiment. That's why you replicate experiments. That's why you conduct experiments from a number of different points of view, is in hopes of discovering the way that things are from the finite point of view that you have available to you as a human being. And so this is sort of, I think, part of what we can get from Leibniz's conception of God, is that we can try to understand the nature of reality as it is metaphysically, not just epistemologically. So not just from the kind of knowledge that we can have about an object, but the way that things really are in their most fundamental basis. And this is why Leibniz calls the text that we're examining a discourse on metaphysics, because it's a discourse on the ultimate or fundamental nature of reality. And then from Leibniz's metaphysical picture of the universe, then we get his treatment of epistemology and philosophy of mind, as well as ethics and, other areas. But for Leibniz, these are really all sort of downstream consequences of his metaphysical picture of reality. So his understanding of what reality is like at its most basic, most fundamental level, as it would be understood directly by God, in which we can only sort of, through a glass darkly, examine ourselves. And so this is really the first part of the discourse on metaphysics, where Leibniz is comparing his conception of God to other modern philosophers. He has in mind more than Descartes and Spinoza, but Descartes and Spinoza are the two figures that we're the most familiar with, and so that we can most readily sort of contrast his conception of God with theirs.